By the 4th century BC, Rome controlled most of central Italy, and its engineers were called on to develop a transportation infrastructure that would connect the expanding empire.
In antiquity, there were basically two modes of transportation. There was transportation through the countryside, either on horseback, but probably walking or in carts, or that there was travel by ship. The roads, as we understand them today, basically didn't exist before the Roman Empire.
That all changed in 312 BC, when the Via Appia was built. Rome's first national highway stretched 132 miles from the capital to its southern province of Campania. To plot the straightest and fastest route down the coast, Roman engineers used a specialized surveying instrument.
The Romans relied on the tool called a groma, which was a vertical pole that stood in the ground with a cross on the top, and you could sight along this cross to line up 2 points in a straight line. The big difference with Roman roads and modern roads is that the Romans couldn't survey a corner, so they were all dead straight, and then they would turn a sharp angle and then go dead straight in another direction. The challenge, of course, with building a dead straight road in any direction is that you come to hills and valleys and you have to cross them. So if they had to, then they would cut through the mountains in order to take the road straight through.
Once the ideal path was cleared, a broad trench was dug and filled in with sand and boulders to form a solid foundation. Next went a layer of gravel compacted with clay or mortar. The top surface was a layer of thick paving stones angled to allow the water to drain off to the side.
The roads were incredibly intimidating. You could look at a road and say, I wonder how long it takes to get a couple of legions, 10,000 guys down this road, right into my backyard. I think I'll think twice about starting any nonsense with Rome.
Under Augustus, the Roman road network expanded to reach the farthest corners of the empire. And with the highways paved, it was time to build new destinations. Rome's engineers had a secret weapon that enabled them to build bigger, stronger, and faster than anyone else. Waterproof concrete, mixed with a volcanic sand called pozzolana.
Early concretes were just a simple lime-mortar mix, which, although they would set, weren't very strong, and indeed the particles in the early concrete could easily break apart. But in Roman concrete, the pozzolan sand reacted with the lime, and it makes a concrete quite like a modern concrete, much, much stronger.
During the age of Augustus, this concrete solidified Rome's chokehold on Western Europe, allowing Roman builders to dominate the landscape with massive man-made monoliths. And as the Romans expanded their empire outward, they also looked inward and used their superior engineering skills to improve the quality of life within the walls of the capital city. Of all the achievements of Rome's engineers, none were as life-altering as running water.
Rome's system of water distribution was a quantum leap to anything which had come before it.
In the capital city, 11 aqueduct lines guided a steady stream of fresh water to its citizens, carrying a combined 200 million gallons a day into the city from mountain springs miles away.
So much water was available in the city of Rome, and this sustained an enormous population.
The aqueducts fostered the growth of a new urban culture. With a constant stream of water, up to 1 million people were able to live cleanly and comfortably in the capital city.
And it's the water from the aqueducts which can flush out the human filth and keep your city clean.
Aqueducts are not that complicated in theory. That is that water seeks its lowest level, and therefore that you can run water down a slope from any area to another area. So that's a pretty simple premise that everybody would have known. But that the practice of creating an aqueduct is another thing.
The Romans engineered their aqueducts to approach the city on a gradual declining angle, or gradient. That gradient was just several inches every 100 feet.
The slope of the aqueduct had to be calculated from great distances, 20, 30, sometimes even 40 miles, from the source in the mountains to the cities themselves. That had to be consistent. They couldn't deviate from it, regardless of what the terrain was.
To maintain the water's precise descent through high mountains, Roman engineers dug perfectly angled tunnels through them. When the pipelines reached low valleys, they were elevated on stone walls. If the walls needed to be higher than 6.5 feet off the ground, the Romans saved building materials while still adding strength by perfecting an ancient engineering concept, the arch.
The arch revolutionized architecture in the ancient world by permitting far greater spans than had been allowable before. They basically changed the spatial conception totally of Roman architecture.
Arches were built around a temporary wooden framework that held each stone in place until the keystone was laid in the center. The keystone evenly distributed weight down each side of the arch, allowing builders to stack additional stones above it.
Arches are improvement upon building just a straight wall in a variety of means, both in terms of their efficiency and in terms of their strength. The arch, of course, takes much less material to build. Arches are very strong at supporting things like roofs and aqueducts and whatever you want to put on top of them.
A 6-mile column of arches carried the Aqua Claudia across the valleys on its way to Rome.
The aqueducts would have had a covered roof, but of course if you could take the roof off, you could see the water like an open river coming down towards the city.
After reaching the city, each aqueduct emptied into 3 holding tanks. One for the public drinking fountains, a second for the public baths, and a third reserved for the emperor and other wealthy Romans who paid for their own running water, a concept that was well ahead of its time.
Basically, every home by the 1st or 2nd century AD of any means had running water. This is astounding, because the entire span of the Middle Ages, they didn't have this.
Unlike Nero, who exploited the skills of his engineers for his own colossal vanity projects, Vespasian would put Rome's greatest architectural minds to work for the people. He would start by draining the massive lake that Nero had built on his palace grounds. On that site would rise Rome's most famous engineering marvel, a place where all the chaos that had consumed the city could be channeled. It would be called the Flavian Amphitheater, though we know it as the Colosseum.
So the statement that Vespasian made was, I am taking a space which is only for the private use of a bad emperor, and now I'm transforming that area into a public space which will be then used for the enjoyment of all the people of Rome. So that was a very bold piece of propaganda.
Gladiators had been spilling blood in the name of entertainment for centuries. But the people of Rome were hungry for bigger, bolder spectacles. The Colosseum would give the gladiators a permanent, state-of-the-art killing field, and the games would take on a level of carnage never before seen in the empire's history.
But this was the big venue. This was the Superdome. The entertainment came to you. Everything from animals from the farthest corners of the known world to captives from faraway lands could be brought to your central location, to your favorite box seat, and right in the center of the city.
Construction on the Colosseum began in 72 AD. They poured more than 6,000 tons of concrete and hauled huge travertine building blocks to the site from a quarry 20 miles away.
as the building progressed up higher, they would use less of the strong, expensive and heavy limestone and more of the cheaper ingredients, which were lighter in weight. The Romans had quite sophisticated wooden cranes and devices for lifting stones, and they'd be able to do that quite easily from the ground and up to great heights.
In just 8 years, the imposing structure grew to 160 feet tall, dwarfing all that surrounded it.
It's the tallest ancient Roman structure ever built. This is the amphitheater of the capital. So what was Rome? Rome was a city that was so much larger than any other city. It was so much richer. So that came to symbolize the power, the engineering, the wealth of ancient Rome.
Roman amphitheaters were constructed from a surprisingly simple framework, incorporating 2 Greek theaters back to back to form one 360-degree theater in the round. The Colosseum set a new standard for Roman amphitheater design. It contained an intricate network of corridors and staircases that could shuffle 70,000 Romans in and out in record time. As with stadiums today, everyone who entered the Colosseum had a ticket corresponding to the number above one of the entry gates. The complex was designed not only to control the crowds, but to keep them comfortable. It had 110 drinking fountains and 2 restrooms, large enough to accommodate a packed house. The Colosseum even had a retractable roof. On hot days, an awning called a velarium was unfurled above the upper deck to shade spectators from the sun. It was operated by sailors from the Roman Navy, who were stationed around the top of the Colosseum's arcade.
They could move it according to the sun and according to the wind, and subsequently, Colosseum was amazingly air-conditioned, shaded, and they would stand on top of the arcade and work these poles, the holes of which we can see on the external side, that would hold this immense canvas that would cover the place.
By 80 AD, the Colosseum was complete. For 100 straight days, Romans flocked to the Colosseum to soak in every kind of carnage imaginable. 5,000 animals were slaughtered in a single day. Thousands of gladiators and prisoners left as corpses. Outside the arena, bloodshed on this scale was known only in war. But inside, it was pure entertainment.
They go for the entire day. And in the morning, they watch men kill or be killed by animals. And around noontime, they're watching the execution of prisoners. And then finally, in the afternoons, from the main event, primetime TV kind of experience is the best for last, and that's going to be gladiators, man against man.
Gladiatorial fights were a big draw at the Colosseum, but they weren't always the main event. Several ancient writers describe live naval battles recreated right in the middle of the arena, with battleships on water.
It would have been entirely possible to have diverted water from one of the aqueducts and brought it to the Colosseum in order to flood the floor to a shallow depth.
We do have evidence due to recent studies of the Colosseum that show there are plenty of channels, water channels, for flooding the substructures of the Colosseum. So yes, it was possible, and yes, it happened.
The Colosseum's naval battles were an astounding engineering triumph, but they proved to be a fleeting trend in the world's most famous arena. Within a decade, flooding operations were abandoned in favor of a renovation that would revolutionize the games. A new 2-story substructure beneath the arena called the Hypogeum. Within it were a system of elevators and trapdoors that enabled tigers and armed gladiators to suddenly pop up through the floor and slaughter their unsuspecting victims.
There were lion runs, cages for wild animals being taunted, gladiators sharpening their swords preparing for death, condemned criminals in cages. As the games begin, a trapdoor in the arena floor will open, and by a system of pulleys, an elevator will hoist another lion or panther up into the arena. When the trapdoor opens, we're bathed in light. We hear the yells of the throng enjoying the games, and then the trapdoor will close again, leaving us contemplating our own demise amongst the screams and lamentations and stench of blood, beasts, and men.
The Pantheon, a majestic temple to the Roman gods.
The Pantheon is arguably the most amazing structure ever built by the Romans. Why? The Rotunda.
The Rotunda, a huge interior space capped by a magnificent dome ceiling, was the heart of the Pantheon's design. At its center, the concrete dome rises nearly 150 feet. It spans exactly the same length across without any support from columns or buttresses.
150 feet is a great distance to span. And the guts that they had to attempt something so wide, to span something so wide, this is one of the grand achievements.
The Pantheon's dome would remain the largest unsupported concrete span in the world for 18 centuries. Before Hadrian's engineers could start pouring the dome's concrete ceiling, they needed to figure out how to direct its weight away from its center. Otherwise, when they removed the wooden framework holding the ceiling in place, 3,000 tons of concrete would collapse under its own weight.
Today, when we build in concrete, we introduce a steel tension rod, which picks up half of the stresses in the concrete. The Romans couldn't do this. Therefore, the dome of the Pantheon was constantly pushing outward towards its base.
The Pantheon's engineers developed several radical solutions to make sure its ceiling and the emperor's reputation wouldn't come crashing down. First, they built a solid base of walls 20 feet thick to act as a foundation for the ceiling.
They used the vertical walls on either side to help support the weight of the dome from pushing outwards. They used the walls to buttress the dome itself.
Next, as the ceiling rose toward its apex, they mixed in lighter materials with the cement and poured a progressively thinner layer of it.
Roman concrete, like concrete today, used aggregate, usually stones, to bond the concrete together. In the Pantheon's dome, Romans used a common technique at that time of actually inserting hollow amphora or jugs inside of the concrete to displace some of the concrete and lighten the load.
To make the ceiling even lighter, the builders molded recessed panels called coffers into the ceiling, which served two ingenious purposes.
These coffers are meant, obviously, for an aesthetic purpose. That is, that they allow the surface of the domed area to be decorated, but at the same time, they reduce the amount of concrete which is necessary for the dome itself.
A final weight-shedding alteration immediately became the Pantheon's most distinctive feature: the oculus, a 30-foot wide hole in the center of the ceiling. The oculus eliminates the stress of heavy concrete at the dome's weakest point, and it lights up the interior like the sun does the earth.
Imagine as an ancient, never having been in this kind of interior space before, because no other interior space had ever looked like it before, feeling the religious aspect of the interior itself. A building which was dedicated to all the gods.
The Pantheon's engineers strove for perfection,